Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out with the breaking news, which is that the Russians have managed to capture a large area in western New York, here in the Donetsk section of the front line. We see this advance with the geolocated footage here of the Russians raising the flag in the school building here in the central parts of the western area of New York. This has completed a complete cut-off of New York from the western parts, the village chain here by the main highway connected to Konstantinivka in the north, as well as cutting off the nearby areas and fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the area. This allows the Russians to focus entirely on the central parts of the city itself, and we see in this direction the Russians, with the capture here in the western parts, can now move to cross over the river line in the northern parts, which would cut off the final road into and outside of New York. The Russians are already present in the eastern parts where they've reached the road going in and out from the eastern parts. There are a few connections and off-roads in the northeastern parts. The Russians will likely work to gain control over the educational area in the eastern parts and move up to the residential area where they can connect with the western parts and gain full control over the area and cut off completely the central parts of New York. This is at the same time as the Ukrainians just recently withdrew from the southeastern parts of New York along the 2014 line of defense that goes through the eastern parts here. Part of this line was withdrawn from with the Ukrainian soldiers re-entering New York from these fortified positions out in the open due to the Russians' advances in New York itself. So we see that the Ukrainians have a significant lack of personnel and forces and firepower in this section of the front line, as Russians are able to constantly cross over the river lines within the city and capture significant portions of the Ukrainian positions. The Russians have not captured any of the central parts because there is this river line that goes through the central parts of the city, all the way from the northern parts in the west through the central parts and then over to the eastern parts. The Russian positions in the other side, the other bank of this river line, are solely in the eastern parts. There's also a connection from this river line that goes through the western parts. This is why the Russians have now put their forces in two positions in this area. They have crossed over the central parts of the western side of the river line and gained a significant portion under their control of Ukrainian positions and captured a stronghold of the Ukrainians in the western parts, completely isolating New York from the west. This allows the Russians to cross over in the western parts of this river line here, which will allow the Russians to then occupy positions north of the industrial area in the central parts of the city, or cross over directly into the industrial area. There is two possibilities of what the Russians will be doing now. Either they'll work to completely encircle the city by moving further north and further northeast of the western parts and further northwest of the eastern parts to connect the two flanks and completely cut off the industrial area and the central parts of the city. The second option is that the Russians will move through the central parts of the city, pushing the Ukrainians out of the city and directly assault the fortified positions of the Ukrainians within it. I'm not sure which they will take, but based on the fact that the Russians are moving here in the western parts in a northern direction, capturing the fortified positions, they're likely going to move further north along this road to gain control and start operations in the direction of Nelipivka. And connecting that as well with the Turets section of the front line will allow the Russians to cut off the entire New York section of the front line completely and the 2014 line of defense completely. Based on this advance, which again was geolocated, which shows that it is accurate, the front line in New York is completely collapsing. With the recent advances by the Russians in the Turets section of the front line as well, it allows Russians to create a potential large-scale maneuver which could cut off hundreds, if not thousands, of Ukrainian soldiers here in the eastern section of New York. The entire 2014 line of defense here in the eastern parts of New York could be completely cut off, and some fortified positions along the distance between New York and Toretsk would also be cut off, and the remaining Ukrainian soldiers within New York could be cut off. All of this could take place with this operation, so the Ukrainians are in a very, very critical situation in New York. This could do one of two things. Either the Ukrainians will remain and start to defend and try to hold the line, but that would require additional reinforcements, otherwise they will likely fail to do so, or they will withdraw out of the city, withdraw back to the defensive lines by Nebelivka and here along the fortified positions to prevent their forces from being encircled. This could be a repeat of the fall of Avdiivka, where towards the end the Ukrainians just completely collapsed and withdrew from Avdiivka, where several units were encircled and others managed to escape. So we see the current effect the fall of New York would have on the front line is the Russians will be able to start attacking from the southern flank of Toretsk, expanding the zone of control of the Russians and the area at which the Russians are fighting over Toretsk. At the same time, the Russians will be able to move along the Kryvyi River, which will allow the Russians to have a strong flank to the west as they move in a northern direction. They could also move to gain control over the fortified line of the Ukrainian defenses here west of New York, which will allow them to expand the front line north of Avdiivka and start operations in the direction of Konstantinivka in a northern direction. So we see Toretsk completely opens up the front line to Toretsk and Konstantinivka by allowing the Russians to completely flank the Ukrainian fortified positions in the area. I was debating making a video about what I would expect a upcoming Ukrainian counteroffensive would look like. But instead we get the utter stupidity of the Ukrainian General Staff launching another PR maneuver in the Sumy region. Not to say that it was unexpected, but instead to say that it is just purely stupid. According to the reports, the Ukrainians launched an offensive here in the Sumy Kursk border region, where they have attacked the village of Uleshnia in the Kursk region, as well as the village of Nikolaeva Darino. So both of these villages were attacked by the Ukrainians. According to the reports, about 300 soldiers, supported by 11 tanks and 22 additional armored vehicles, attacked the Russian positions here in these two villages near the border area. The border patrol troops, which are Russian conscripts, as well as the Russian 22nd Separate Mechanized Brigade, as well as FSB units and anti-UAV units, fought against this Ukrainian assault across the border on the Kursk region. And according to the reports coming from the area, heavy fighting continued for much of the day, but recently, just a few hours ago, the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed that they have dispelled the attack and that they have managed to force the Ukrainians to withdraw from this cross-border assault. There is footage coming out of Russian conscripts who have been taken prisoner from this raid, which is to be expected. These are soldiers with barely any training, as they've gotten their basic training and then they're deployed by the border area. These are young people, and these are not professional soldiers. The way the frontline positions work for the Russians is that they have troops near the front in the fortified positions they have prepared in the area. These are the units of the 22nd Separate Mechanized Brigade. At the same time, they have border guards. These are border guards that are simply to fill in the gaps in the front line to prevent saboteurs or other special forces units from going through unnoticed, to prevent infiltration into the country. This requires a lot of manpower. This is why they cannot use professional soldiers. They rely on the conscripts, which they conscript every year in the spring and in the fall. So this means that there are some conscripts who will be near the front line and in danger of fighting. So we see that the fighting took place, the Ukrainians have withdrawn and have taken some prisoners with them. At the same time, the assault was a complete failure, as besides that was the one success they had. Other than that, the Russians launched heavy artillery, UAV drones, and FAB strikes on their positions. But that is not even the worst part. This could have happened anywhere on the front line. It happens every day in the Donetsk and Zaporizhia and Luhansk regions of the front line, in the Kharkiv region as well. The issue is that the Ukrainian lines are collapsing both in New York and in the Avdiivka section of the front line. The recent advance by the Russians in New York is a complete collapse of the Ukrainian defenses in New York. They need to reestablish completely new defenses to be able to slow down the Russian forces. The Ukrainians are not receiving additional reinforcements or aid that is enough to hold the lines in the east, yet they do these PR disaster operations in the north. Some may argue, and some do argue, as we see here in this Twitter conversation, Jack Henson says, the attack makes perfect sense. Russia can't ignore it. This brings the fight to Russian soil. They will have to divert resources. Russian aircraft will be drawn to defend, making them vulnerable to loss to F-16 and Patriots, which can outrange glide bombs. Tatarigami UA, who is a former Ukrainian officer and does a lot of analysis, they have reserves there, which they will deploy, and I have been tracking them since spring. I don't foresee Russians needing to redeploy resources from the Donetsk Oblast. They may bring in additional reserves from Bryansk or Belgorod Oblasts, but this won't affect Donbass. This is indeed a correct analysis. The Russians already have a fighter group for the jets. They have additional troops who have not entered the Kharkiv region. They had a group of 50,000 soldiers, according to sources from both sides, in the Belgorod region and the Kursk region, Sumy border area, and the Kharkiv border area. But they've only engaged a fraction of those forces, whether it is 25%, 20%, somewhere around that. That means the majority of these forces are still on the Russian side of the border. They simply need to move a small bit. As we already saw, the 22nd Separate Mechanized Brigade was already present in the area when the Ukrainians attacked. This is why it's such a complete failure. The Russians have forces in the border area. They are ready to defend and attack the Ukrainian side in this border area. This has zero effects on anywhere else on the front line, unlike the Russian Kharkiv offensive, which drew a large portion of Ukrainian soldiers from the east to the north. This has had zero effects in the Toretsk direction, in the New York direction, in the Avdiivka direction, or anywhere else in the eastern part of the front line or southern part of the front line. So this is just simply completely stupid. And this is another screenshot from the same conversation with a different person. Tatarigami UA writes, the situation in the Pokrovsk direction is critical, with defenses in several areas collapsed and yet to stabilize, largely due to a shortage of personnel. Diverting nearly a brigade to launch an assault on Kursk Oblast, which lacks strategic sense, borders on mental disability. This is something I've been saying for a long time. I also said when Syrsky replaced Zaluzhny that was one of the biggest mistakes of the Ukrainians in this war. The CLDF then replies, is that nearly a brigade though? If 2,000 men and hundreds of armors were crossing into Russia, wouldn't we have Sala footage of it all over Russian Telegram? I'm sure you have your sources, but I just find it strange that there's no footage of massive movement yet. Tatarigami then replies, even during the counter-offensive in the summer, with fully manned and equipped brigades, we never saw 2,000 men at the same time. He means that this is just a small portion of the Ukrainian soldiers in the border area to fight into the Kursk region. This is a brigade in the current context of war, not per paper. Some Ukrainian brigades have fewer functional combat vehicles than you can even count on your fingers, so less than 10. That is the current state of the Ukrainian army. Some brigades rely so heavily on the manpower and UAVs because they simply do not have vehicles to use. And that is because the Western aid has not held up and the Ukrainian defense industry have been hit hard by Russian long-distance strikes. Therefore, we can see that this operation in the north is purely PR. It is likely a distraction from the collapse in New York and Toretsk. We see that the Russians are constantly advancing, and the only place where the Ukrainians could use such an operation by the Ukrainians armed forces to send reinforcements, send additional material, or even use the F-16s is in the Donetsk region, where the Russian offensive is ongoing, and they have more than enough forces, both in reserve and across the front, to respond to any sort of Ukrainian offensive. The Kharkiv offensive of the Ukrainians was very successful because the Russians were at that point stretched very thinly across the front. They had a few concentrations, but large areas were largely undefended. That is not the case today. The Russians have mobilized hundreds of thousands of soldiers since then. They have recruited hundreds of thousands of soldiers since then. The Russians do not lack manpower anywhere on the front. The Ukrainians do, yet the Ukrainians launched this sort of PR operation similar to what the Russians did a few weeks ago. But this is a larger scale, and it's just stupid. I don't know why they're doing it. It's just stupid. Finally, in the south by Nevelsky, the Russians have made a small advance, as is seen with this geolocated footage. This shows the Russians are continuing their operations north of Krasnoyarivka, following the recent capture of the northwestern outskirts of the city, and then the following fighting taking place in the suburban areas of Krasnoyarivka. We see that the Russians continue their operations. Krasnoyarivka is a great example. It had a pre-war population of about 16,000 people. New York had a pre-war population of about 10,000 people. New York has been fought over for about a month. Krasnoyarivka has been fought over for over 2 years, about 2.5 years by now. Both are located near the 2014 line of defense, the one that has been prepared for 10 years. They are practically identical situations. Yes, Ukraine have managed to hold on to Krasnoyarivka for 2.5 years. New York is falling after only a month and a half. That is the current state of the Ukrainian armed forces. Just to make it clear, the Ukrainians are in the worst position they've been in since the very start of the war. Therefore, to end off this video, I just want to say, for the last time, Ukraine, seek peace, negotiate. I told you the same thing 1 year ago. What has happened since last year is non-stop Russian advances. Russians have advanced all across the front line. They've entered the Kharkiv region, they've captured Avdiivka, they're capturing New York and Tursk, they're moving on to Pokrovsk. The Ukrainian lines in the Donetsk region are collapsing. And this is only the start if you do not negotiate. So Ukraine, for the last time, because I'm not saying this because I don't want to warn them again. It is simply because this is the last time they have to negotiate. Anytime in the future, they will never be able to do it again. That is simply because the Russians will simply win this war completely if they do not negotiate right now. They still have forces which can significantly hurt the Russian armed forces, cause tens of thousands of casualties. All of that can be avoided if they simply negotiate now and seek peace.